Hi, good evening. It's Thursday evening, and tonight I'm going to talk about Chapter 9, a chapter on marketing segmentation. It's not a very difficult chapter. We can go through it rather quickly. It's very straightforward, and you have to do the quiz this week, not Friday before midnight, but I'm extending it until Sunday since I'm posting this lecture later in the week than usual. And after this video, I'm going to make another video talking about Brooklyn Business Assignment number 2. So we have that due this week also, but we're going to extend it so that you can hand that in also on Sunday before midnight. But I'm going to only focus here on Chapter 9 and on marketing segmentation for today. So let's talk about this concept. In the chapter, to begin with, you start out by reading about how marketers wish we could all live in a world where we didn't have segmentation, where every person behaved like every other person, where we basically had a kind of mass consumer. And that would make marketing, that would make business very much easier, right? So you wouldn't have to, if you were a company that was manufacturing clothing and all women had the same attitudes and had the same preferences, and there weren't big geographical differences like, people who lived in very hot climates maybe need different fabrics than people who live in very cold parts of the world. So if you had a situation like this where there were not those differences and there weren't psychological or psychographic differences, and people more or less had the same demographic profile, so they had the same incomes, they were almost all middle class, let's say, it would make it very simple because you would know the right price, you could just make one pair of jeans and every woman would be satisfied, and maybe they would be satisfied for 3, 4, or 5 years, and then they would change, but they would all change in the same way, and maybe they'd all make a little more money, so they could afford to buy a higher price jean, but it wouldn't be very complicated. But then the world would be of course, much less interesting, right? Think about a fragrance company. What if all women were satisfied with the same fragrance? That would be a different situation. And think about, too, in our culture, we have one of the big demographic differences is that we have different likes and dislikes for males and females. There's no reason we could argue that male and female have to dress differently. You could have one type of clothing that everybody wore, and that would be we could imagine that could be a society where that could have been thought to be very logical. But in our society, it's not the case. And we have certain clothes that are associated with masculine identities and certain with feminine identities, right? And the bridal gown is a very feminine kind of expression, and it's not possible for a male to wear such a costume on a wedding because that would be inappropriate in our society. So think about fragrances. We have certain kinds of scents that we associate with women. So very floral scents that are very sweet are different from fragrances that are typically considered male fragrances that have a more spicy or a different kind of very strong type of scent. And so you have two different demographics. So you have to segment your business into at least two different for male and female. But then, of course, within the female population, you have some women who like this type of fragrance, that type of fragrance. You have people who can afford to buy the perfume, people who could only afford to buy the cologne. So you have to have many different product lines, plus you have to have different fragrances for different preferences. And you have to change because people get bored, and some people want the same thing. So those people, maybe you have to keep one continuous packaging and fragrance for people who want the same thing, right? There's, for example, in Chanel, they have Chanel number 5 that has been around for quite a long time. And so you have some things that stay the same, and then you have many more fragrances that change by season, or every 2 or 3 years, or every year a new one is brought out as well. And lots of variations of the same within the same brand. So that's what makes marketing more complicated, and people are probably more differentiated even as individuals today than they had ever been in the past. So that people tend to feel that they're unique, that they have certain kinds of needs, that their needs are different from their best friend's needs, where in a more collective orientation, people would all be wearing the same styles or would want to drive almost the same type of car, so that they could be part of the group. And so today we have that, of course, but we also have this differentiation and this individuality, which based on many different variables that intersect also. So when we talk about demographics and psychographics and behavioral characteristics, these all combine in different ways too to make them even more complicated. But basically what we have to think about is that you create a segment when you see that there is a group of people that are responding differently, behaving differently. I mean, the example of a customer who bakes bread every day, so who has to buy a huge amount of flour because every day she's baking bread or he's baking bread, is a customer who's going to buy in bulk, who's going to want to, he may be very price conscious because that's something that's a staple that they have to buy. And they're going to be also maybe very concerned about the ingredients, and they're going to be very interested in knowing about the manufacturing process because this is something that's very integral to their everyday life, the buying of this flour and the making of bread. For somebody else who buys flour once a year because they're going to make a birthday cake, that person actually might want to buy a very small package because they're never going to use it again, or they're not going to use it for another year, and they want to have just a single usage. So for that customer, the price could be very high because they're only buying it once and they're willing to pay a lot of money for it, and they don't need to replace it. And so that's a very different kind of customer. So even with the same product, you might want to have different price points, you might want to have different packaging, you might want to have different, all different ways of reaching the customer. So the customer that's making the bread all the time is maybe reading cooking magazines, you might want to advertise there. For the customer that buys it just once, a different type of way that you might reach that person. And so this issue of repositioning a product can come into play. So you have the same product, but you position it differently according to the segment that you're trying to target. So that's another issue to think about. And think about in relation to this, I'm going to give you a film that I would recommend you to see because it's an important film that is very relevant culturally. It's called The Stepford Wives. It was made in 1975, and it's a very interesting film to see because in that film, don't see the new version, there was another remake, and that remake was made a couple of years ago, but it's not at all, it's really bad. It loses the the tension that the original film had. And the reason the original film was interesting is because it took place in 1975, a year that was interesting, or a time period that was very interesting because there were a lot of changes, a lot of cultural changes, a lot of social changes, and people had started to question the way things were always done, right? So for a long time, there was an assumption about the proper kind of behavior for males and females. Men grew up knowing very, very definitely what their role in life was going to be, and it was going to be just exactly like the role that their father played, so that they had to be the breadwinner, they had to support the family, they were going to be the head of the household, the one who would be making the important decisions, and the wife was going to be a kind of maybe helpmate to her husband. She would be somebody who would be not the supporting, would be in the supporting role versus the leading role in the household, so that she would be taking care of the children, she would be providing a life for her family, but she wouldn't be the one who would be making all the major decisions, and her husband would have that role because he would be the breadwinner, he would be the head of the household. So that was something that was taken for granted, and that people, for generations accepted and lived according to those assumptions. And then all of a sudden in the late 60s, you have these challenges, you have the concept that everybody has to think about and formulate their own identity. This is something very new, very different. And especially, it's not that it wasn't possible for people to be individual, but the social regulations and norms were extremely rigid, and the penalty for not following, for doing something outside of those norms was very severe. And so people were basically reproducing and reproducing the cultural norms that their families had upheld, and not challenging them and not trying to dismantle them, certainly. So this idea of rebelliousness and of individuality becomes very important. And then there's a tension at that time in the 1970s because people are insecure, people are unsure, people are rather, people are perhaps, there's also a new freedom and a new kind of sense of innovation and change, but with that comes also a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety because now people don't know what to expect. Is my marriage going to work? Is my family life going to be satisfactory? Whereas perhaps the father or mother never had to ask that question because things happened in a very, very predictable way. Or people didn't expect, maybe, even to have the level of personal satisfaction in their lives that perhaps they all of a sudden started to expect to have. So imagine, for example, people who grew up in a certain religion and their parents had raised them in that religion are all of a sudden questioning and saying, well, maybe I can choose a new religion. And so you have people, for example, people who may have been Protestant, like the majority of Americans were, and you have a person now who decides that they want to study Hinduism and they're going to go to live in India and learn about Hinduism and become a Hindu. And so this was for parents, as you could imagine, it was very shocking because it wasn't their heritage, it wasn't their tradition, and all of a sudden they're adopting a totally new lifestyle that was never something that was even on the horizon for the parents. They never even thought about these things. And so this is the kind of time period in which things are always open to question versus fixed and established and determined. So this is a new way of thinking, and this is very important for consumerism and for marketing because now all of a sudden you have the individual who you have to appeal to on a different level. So you're not going to appeal to people in terms of being like everybody else, but you're going to have to appeal to people on the basis of being who they want to be and to provide, and think about today with social media, how that's become even more a challenge for brands because now every person wants to rank and to rate and to evaluate and to be able to complain about and to change a brand perhaps even according to the way they feel the brand should respond to them. And each person has a slightly different idea about that. So that's created a new relationship and a new kind of challenge. So the important thing about this film is that it takes place during that period where people are very unsure of life, and there's a sense of anxiety, a sense of fear to some extent. And so the film really maybe exaggerates that to a great extent, and it even goes in the realm of science fiction. But it looks at a couple, it looks at a man and a woman who are living in Manhattan, and the man on his own pretty much decides that they're going to move to the suburbs. They're going to move to somewhere in Westchester, to this town called Stepford. And the husband more or less makes this decision on his own. He doesn't really consult his wife. All of a sudden, her life is turned upside down, and now that he's packing up the family and moving to this big house in the suburbs, where she's going to be then basically confined because her husband's going to go to work in Manhattan in his advertising agency, and she's going to be home all day with the kids, and she's going to be living a different type of life where she's not going to have the same amount of flexibility as she did in Manhattan, where she could go out to the park and take a walk and